There we go. And then as far as our PDH hours, if anyone does require any professional development hours, please just shoot me an email at jrjordan@scasphalt.org. And again, that's just the mute button there in the chat. And if you do have any questions, just throw it in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll monitor that. And then as we go along, or as we get to the end, we can save those questions for Joseph. And I believe Joseph's got a hard stop at 4, so we'll try to get off before then. All right, so I'm going to throw it over. I'm going to stop my share, Joseph, and then I'm going to let you hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Jason. Before I get started, as I'm just kind of pulling up my screen here, just a little background on myself. I've been at NAPA almost 5 years now in the role of Director of Sustainable Pavements. And my primary role is, am I sharing the right screen? Let me just ask the question.
I see your PowerPoint, Joseph.
Okay, good. So yeah, my primary role is supporting our EPD program and everything related to it, as well as NAPA's Sustainability Committee. I do have a little experience down in South Carolina. My mother lives upstate, up in Liberty, just a few minutes away from the King Asphalt plant in Liberty. I've been down to Charleston a bunch of times, and Columbia, so I've definitely been had a lot of great visits in that state, and wish I was there right now rather than up here. It's a little about 20 degrees colder here. But before my time at NAPA, I actually lived in Hawaii for about 17 years, and 9 of them I worked for Grace Pacific, which is largest asphalt mix producer and paving contractor in the state. So for the Hawaii folks on there on this call, aloha, I wish I was there as well. Maryland's not quite as nice as either Hawaii or South Carolina in some ways. So getting started on this talk, I'm going to kick it off with a explanation of the alphabet soup, because I threw a lot of them into the title. So to make sure you know what all of them mean. LCA, we're talking about life cycle assessment. EPD is your environmental product declaration. IIJA is the Infrastructure Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the one that kind of came at us as a surprise last year. And then CEQ is the White House Council on Environmental Quality. All of these will be talked about over the course of this presentation. And I want to start, before we talk about all this content, kind of a bigger picture kind of initiative what NAPA is involved with. And so back in, let me get my years correct here, back in the second half, fall of 2020, we were kind of looking at what's going on at the national level with respect to sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions. And NAPA's executive committee, currently the board of directors, put together, basically mandated that we put together a task force to develop an industry-wide vision for the industry, vision and goals for sustainability for the industry. Now, what that means is, this task force had three objectives. One was to develop sustainability and resilience related objectives for the industry. 2 was to develop a communication strategy around these 2 topics. And then 3 was to develop a research and implementation roadmap to advance the industry towards whatever objectives this group identifies. So one of the so on this task force, we wanted to have a kind of broad representation of NAPA's membership. So we had 13 producer members with kind of broad geographic diversity, and also diversity in terms of large companies and small companies, everyone from companies that own 1 plant to the largest companies with hundreds of plants. We had an associate member represented. We had a couple of the state asphalt pavement associations, myself and Richard Willis on the NAPA staff. And then we had a couple of 3 academics, the professors who kind of help make sure that we're, keep us in line and make sure that we're kind of moving in the right direction. Now, one of the first things this group did We looked at this mandate, the previous mandate here, to develop objectives for the industry related to sustainability and resilience. And we decided to narrow that focus significantly to only cover greenhouse gas emissions. And the result of this effort was launched in January of 2022, so a year ago now, called the Road Forward. And that's the vision for achieving net zero emissions in the asphalt paving industry. I'd encourage you to take a look at this website, asphaltpavement.org/climate. The vision for this initiative is for sustainable communities and commerce connected by net zero carbon emission asphalt pavements. Of course, who doesn't want sustainable communities and commerce? And of course, we want them to be connected by asphalt pavements. And then the add-on here is those pavements will be net zero. The goal here is to achieve net zero by the year 2050 across the industry. So our mission is to engage, educate, and empower the U.S. asphalt community to produce and construct net zero carbon emission asphalt pavements. So one word in here I want to kind of dwell on, and that's the word community. It doesn't say industry here, it says community. We say that because a lot of what we do depends heavily on what our customers require, right? We build and design our mixes and build our projects to customer specifications. So in a lot of ways, we're constrained by what those specifications say. So we need to engage those folks at the agency level or private level customers to help us meet these goals. And we also rely heavily on upstream suppliers of products, asphalt binder, aggregates, additives, even our equipment, paving equipment, asphalt plants. And so we rely on those. And so that upstream kind of suppliers to our industry are part of this community. So that's the goals of this program. There are 4 major prongs here to this initiative. The first is production and construction. These are our direct emissions as an industry. If you were going to use a corporate greenhouse gas reporting framework, you would call this our scope 1 emissions. So that production and construction is the stack emissions out of the baghouse, the asphalt plant, tailpipe emissions out of our paving equipment and trucks and that sort of thing. The second one is electricity. So if you're consuming electricity at your asphalt plant, that electricity is being produced at some power plant somewhere, which, unless it's clean energy, probably has some sort of emissions associated with it. So it's starting to think about what is the supply of our electricity to our plants, and can we get that to be clean or net zero? And this will become more and more important as we start to see trucks and even construction equipment becoming electrified, or even electrifying processes at the asphalt plant. We currently rely on fuel combustion. So that electricity piece is probably going to be more and more important as time goes on. The third one is supply chain. This is looking at our upstream suppliers, the binder manufacturers, the aggregate suppliers, the additive suppliers, seeing what can they do to help reduce emissions in that supply chain so that we can benefit from that and then pass that benefit along to our customers. And then the fourth prong here is the quality, durability, longevity, and efficiency. This is looking downstream at our customers. So we produce and place the mix, and then they're the ones who use it and maintain it. But they also design it. So this is thinking about things like perpetual pavement design to improve the durability and quality and longevity of asphalt mixes, of asphalt pavements, or using polymer modified mixes to improve the durability, or thinking about how smoothness can affect vehicle fuel consumption and energy efficiency for the users of the roads. So that's the kind of fourth prong, looking downstream at our customers and engaging with them on these sorts of topics. So that's a kind of high-level overview of the Road Forward program. We launched this in January 2022. We've since brought on a number of partners, and I just want to take a moment to recognize them. You'll probably see some familiar logos here. These are all companies that have signed on to supporting this program financially and are also getting involved with in-kind assistance, contributions, and that sort of thing. So we sincerely thank all those companies that are part of this program. Okay, so now I'm going to get, one last thing that I want to mention on this kind of big picture. One of the programs kind of working with federal agencies and putting together to help move the industry forward. We've been working with the US EPA's Energy Star program for the last several years. We're an Energy Star partner at NAPA. And we put together this energy performance peer exchange group for asphalt plants called APEX. So this is an opportunity for you, your company, to work with EPA's Energy Star program. This is for their industrial plants program, similar to but different from the Energy Star certifications on appliances that you see at the, I would say Sears, but Sears doesn't really exist anymore, but at the department when you're buying appliances. So through this program, you can partner with EPA, you can promote your company's partnership and market on it, you can learn about energy management, obviously, and you have access to one of their industrial energy advisors to help you develop your company's energy management program. So I really encourage you to take a look at this program. We're happy to bring on new folks in this program. Okay, so let's now, 15 minutes in, jump into the subject matter that we're here to talk about, and that's EPDs. So starting with EPDs, there's a term that I want to familiarize everyone with, and that is, I'm going to start with, this term is embodied carbon. And this is a term you might be familiar with because it's getting more and more use in kind of the popular media, and you might have seen this around. But when you talk about greenhouse gas emissions, embodied carbon is all the emissions associated with manufacturing, transporting, and installing, and even maintaining your buildings and your infrastructure. So look around you, you've got, you're sitting in a room with carpet, probably with painted walls and windows and lighting fixtures and a concrete or steel structure. So it's all the emissions associated with manufacturing all those products in the building. And in a roadway, it would be similar. It's all the emissions associated with manufacturing and constructing the pavement, the base, curb and gutter, striping, all that sort of thing. And then the operational carbon is the carbon needed to actually operate that asset. So in your building, it's your lighting, it's your heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and the roadway is going to be the vehicle fuel consumption. So those are these two key things. When we talk about EPDs, we're talking about the embodied carbon, right? It's generally difficult to quantify, but we have a way to quantify it with EPDs. And that's the whole point of this program. So what is an EPD? Environmental Product Declaration. It's often given an analogy as a nutrition label, like an environmental version of a nutrition label. So instead of giving you facts about the vitamins and the carbohydrates and the saturated fat, it gives you information about the energy and the environmental impacts associated with manufacturing a product. So EPDs are governed by international standards and product-specific standards called product category rules. It's considered an environmental label by ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. And the purpose of an EPD is to enable comparisons between products that fulfill the same function. So you're quantifying environmental information about this product and then to enable comparisons. Now, when you talk about the same function, one is you have to have the same set of product category rules, and we'll get into that later in this presentation. But within the context of an asphalt mix, I would say that products that meet the same specification for a mix type, for example, fulfill the same function. If you have different specs, they're different products, right? You wouldn't put a surface mix as a binder course or a base course, right? And you would use a porous asphalt or a porous pavement project and maybe not on a regular highway pavement, right? So that, to me, I think the important thing here is that same function we're referring to specifications around mix types. EPDs are also independently verified, and that's an important component of the program. It provides that veracity, that assurance that everything is meeting all the requirements, that the data is reasonable, and that sort of thing. So when we talk about EPDs, the important thing to note here is that EPDs have a quote cradle to gate scope. In this diagram here on the right, you see the life cycle of a pavement, starting with materials, referred to as A1, right? So you have the raw material extraction. This is, blasting and crushing the rock to get aggregates. This is for asphalt binder, everything from extracting petroleum out of the ground, transporting it to a refinery operations, transporting the finished binder to a terminal and the terminal operations, right? That's all part of that upstream raw material extraction and processing stage. Then you're going to transport those materials to your asphalt plant. Then you're going to produce those at your plant, the production. And those are the three stages covered by an EPD. Once you go beyond those stages, they're not covered by an EPD, primarily because the manufacturer or the mix producer doesn't always have a lot of control over where the job site's going to be, who's going to construct it, what their paving kind of operations are going to be, what kind of equipment they're going to use, how that pavement is going to be used, what the traffic loading is going to be on it, how it's going to be maintained over the long term by the agency, and then what's going to happen to it at the end of life. Those additional life cycle stages can be evaluated by doing a life cycle assessment. And there's software available, a number of software packages out there to do that. The one that's kind of gaining a lot of traction right now was developed by Federal Highways Administration called LCA Pave. And what's interesting about LCA Pave is it's designed to allow you to take an EPD for the cradle to gate stages and use that as a data source to plug into a full life cycle assessment to look at the additional life cycle stages. LCA Pave is also Excel based, so it's reasonably easy to use. I wouldn't call it easy to use, but it's not nearly as advanced as some of the other software packages out there. And it's designed for pavements, so it uses a lot of the terminology and concepts from pavement design. One thing is it does not include the use stage because there's no real kind of consensus on which models to use during that use stage of pavements. So that's kind of the basic introduction of what EPDs are and kind of how they fit into the full life cycle of a pavement, and then looking at life cycle assessment in general. So let's now dive into kind of the meat of this presentation, which is what's going on at the policy level. I need to take a moment here to kind of center myself because there's a lot going on, and this presentation, literally, I can update it almost every week because there's so much going on. I had a presentation about 2 weeks ago similar to this, and since then I've added a couple of slides for new things that have come out just in the past week or so. So when we talk about policy level and EPDs and embodied carbon, you got to start with Buy Clean legislation. And this was kicked off initially in the state of California, probably not much of a surprise to folks here, when they issued their Buy Clean California Act back in 2017. Now that act does not apply to asphalt or concrete for that matter. It does apply to steel and flat glass and glass wool insulation. But what it does is it requires contractors who supply those materials to the state of California for state-funded projects to, one, provide an EPD, and then two, for each of those materials, the agency establishes a maximum, call it GWP limit. GWP is the global warming potential or the carbon footprint of your product. So there's a maximum limit. So your product has to be under that maximum limit to qualify to be used on a project in the state of California. So this is like a pre-qualification requirement. So that was the California approach. Caltrans, California Department of Transportation, looked at what was going on at the legislature, and they said, you know what, we're going to run a pilot program for asphalt, concrete, and aggregates. They've done that. They're expanding their pilot program. We're also anticipating that there may be a bill this legislative session that could expand the program by law into these other materials. So then in 2021, we had the Buy Clean Colorado Act, which was similar, but different in some ways. And then a similar act in Oregon as well in 2021 that passed. So both of these, maybe the Oregon bill was 2022, starting all to kind of run together. But these 3 states have, at the state level, established policies that require contractors to provide EPDs, and eventually will meet some goals or targets to reduce emissions. You also have local agencies, and in orange I have New York and New Jersey. You have the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, local agency, right there, Port Authority. Significantly large agency. They have a couple $2 billion in construction spending every year, but they have their own BiClean program that they're implementing. And then a number of other states that have at least considered similar laws. Now, in all honesty, I wouldn't expect South Carolina to be on this list anytime soon, but it's just something to be aware of. And the important part here is these state laws are really driving the model for what the federal government is looking at implementing. So let's talk about the federal projects. So last year, in February of 2022, sorry, GSA, the General Services Administration, they reached out to us and they said, hey, we're going to be doing BiClean. We have all this funding from the Infrastructure Act. We want it to go to clean materials, right? And they had a bunch of questions for us. They put out an RFI for industry. And a month later, they had a policy. In 1 month, a federal agency went from the starting line to a published policy. And I've never seen a federal agency move anywhere near that quickly. So they called it their environmentally preferable asphalt standard. I don't know where the and is in there, so I'm sorry. And in that standard, so this applies to GSA managed projects. So federal office buildings, federal courthouses, and land ports of entry. I know there's none of them in South Carolina or in Hawaii, but you certainly do have office building and courthouses. So if you're doing a project on one of those projects, on one of those types of properties for the GSA, they're going to require that you submit an EPD for each mix. They're also going to require that you employ at least 2 environmentally preferable techniques, and they have a menu of techniques that are qualified. Minimum wrap content, using warm mix technology to reduce mix production temperature, using other recycled materials in your mix, reducing the carbon intensity of your equipment or plants, and they do let you qualify natural gas consumption at the asphalt plant as a allowed thing here, qualifying activity. And then they also say, hey, if you can't do one of these, but you're doing something different, you can tell us what you're doing that you think is environmentally preferable, and we'll consider it. So GSA is in the process of revising this. We anticipate they're going to actually develop some sort of benchmarks or thresholds that you have to meet to qualify, but they are in the process of revising this. We don't know a whole lot more about what that's going to look like at this point in time, but we've been pretty engaged with them. They've been pretty open to us sharing their ideas and thoughts. We just haven't seen a lot of clarity on what the next version of this looks like. So that's just one federal agency. But what happened about a year ago, a little over a year ago, is there was a executive order from the Biden administration that created a BiClean task force that's housed under the White House Council on Environmental Quality. This is where CEQ comes into the picture. So that task force is coordinating across a number of federal agencies that collectively represent 90% of the federally financed and purchased construction materials. So these are federal agencies that are purchasing materials. So think about things like national parks, federal lands, which is a really big deal in the western states, not as much of a deal in the eastern states. Agencies like NASA, that sort of thing. If you're working with a federal agency, it may not be managed by GSA, but it is a federal agency. Department of Defense facilities, for example, naval facilities, Army Corps bases, Army Corps of Engineers managed projects. So these are the types of agencies working in this task force. They're focused on 4 materials to begin with, and asphalt is one of those 4 materials. Through this task force, the US DOT has issued its own BiClean policy statement saying they're going to, explore the use of EPDs and develop BiClean policies based on EPDs. They're also going to be partnering with state DOTs to align the state by clean policies, with federal initiatives. So there's a lot of action going on in this space. So let's jump forward to the Inflation Reduction Act, because there's a lot that happened with that bill. And if you recall, this was originally a big climate bill that was supposed to happen, and then Senator Manchin from West Virginia said, I'm not gonna go for it. I don't like it. It's dead. Everyone thought it was dead and would never rise again. And then all of a sudden in August last year, he came out and had an agreement with Chuck Schumer, and they signed the bill, and they passed the bill, and it was signed by the president. And we had the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So there's lots of funding in this program for climate change related mitigation. And there's a couple pieces that apply directly to our industry. So for the EPA, first of all, they got $250 million to standardize EPDs and also help industry develop EPDs. They're going to be issuing grants to industry. So we don't know a whole lot more about that. They just last Friday issued a request for information around these topics. So those comments are due in May. So we expect maybe by the end of this year, we'll have a little more clarity on what that's going to look like. But that program is up and running. It's just getting started. They also have $100 million to develop a, quote, low-embodied carbon construction material labeling program. So similar to the Energy Star labeling program for appliances, the EPA is going to run a program that says, if you want your product to be called a low-embodied carbon product, you have to meet these requirements. So that's also underway and also part of the RFI that was just issued. EPA is hiring 24 people to staff this office currently. So there's a major initiative to kind of bring this program up to speed. So another part of the Inflation Reduction Act that's related to this is there's $2 billion in grants to the DOT, Federal Highways Administration, for state and local agencies to use, as well as federal agencies, for federal aid highways. And this $2 billion will provide for either the differential cost or an incentive to procure substantially products with substantially lower embodied carbon. So what does that mean? How do we define this, right? So now let me just stop for a second. This is the federal government giving money to state and local agencies that are going to then become willing to pay a premium for these, quote, low carbon materials. This is a kind of a sea change from the low bid environment that we've lived in with federally funded projects for the last decades and decades. So pretty significant. So how is this going to be defined? We've been asking this question since this bill passed in August. Just this past week, we got a little bit more clarity because the EPA issued an initial determination of what defines a substantially lower embodied carbon. So this is an interim. So we expect this guidance to change, and they clearly state this will develop over time. But currently, the best performing 20% of similar materials and products. Remember, we talked about that at the beginning. How do you compare our EPDs? What's comparable? It's based on specifications, right? So this would be defined at the agency level. And ideally, we're not exactly sure how it's going to play out in the policy space. But for example, South Carolina DOT or Hawaii DOT wanted to say, hey, we have this mix type, we have 5, 10 different mix types. They would assign thresholds for each of them. So you'd have the top 20% performing materials, or the lowest GWPs. And if that's not locally available, then you'd go to the top 40% of performing materials. And if that's not available locally, then you go to better than the estimated industry average, right? So the agencies will be developing these thresholds based on published EPDs. So if you want to have a say in how these thresholds are defined, the most important thing you could be doing now is thinking about, how do I get my plants to publish EPDs on these kinds of products so that we can be included in the definitions of what the best performing products are. So another thing they're adding, I mentioned earlier, the Energy Star program. So one of the programs, sub-programs within Energy Star is the as a tool called the Energy Performance Indicator, which gives your plant a 1 to 100 rating on its energy performance based on its annual kind of operational efficiency. And in this program, they want the contractors or the suppliers to report their Energy Star energy performance score. So we're currently working with EPA to develop that tool. We expect it'll be out later on this year, but that's something to really keep an eye on. So it's not, there's no thresholds or limits built into this, but it's a reporting requirement. So just something else to keep an eye on. Now, one more thing related to EPDs, if you're familiar with Federal Highways Administration's Everyday Counts initiative, they are just in the process right now of launching their 7th iteration of EDC, Everyday Counts. And there are 2 programs within the EDC 7 related to this. One is integrating greenhouse gas assessment and reduction targets in transportation planning. Probably not directly related to our industry, but could indirectly affect our industry. And then the second one is EPDs for sustainable project delivery. So what this means with Everyday Counts, you're going to have federal highways and all their regional offices and all the regional engineers at their offices given a whole set of tools and information to help deploy this, to help state DOTs get over the hump on educating them and encouraging them to integrate EPDs into their process. This dovetails into funding available through the Inflation Reduction Act and as well as the other federal initiative, other federal buy clean initiatives. So this program over the next few months is really going to be rolling out more broadly, but we're currently working with federal highways on the deployment of this program. So in the title of this, I also had the Infrastructure Act. And there's something I want to mention on this topic on the Infrastructure Act, and that's the carbon reduction program. If you've seen any kind of presentation on what was in the Infrastructure Act and that sort of thing, what it funds, one of the things that you probably learned and you might remember is that there are a whole bunch of new programs, right? Some of them are formula fund programs, some of them are grant programs, but there's a whole bunch of new programs for state and local agencies to tap into for specific types of projects. So the carbon reduction program is a $6.4 billion program over 5 years. And the goal is to reduce transportation related emissions. The focus, as you read the language in the law, is on things like vehicle fuel consumption, right? So you read it and it's clearly talking about things like transit projects, bike lanes, electric vehicle infrastructure. So we saw this when the Infrastructure Act was being debated, and we said, well, there's nothing in here for pavements. We want something here for low carbon pavements. So we worked on an amendment. We got bipartisan support for an amendment that would have put paving activities as eligible for funding under this $6.4 billion program. Now, I should add that this is an apportionment program, which means that every state DOT automatically gets the funding. They just have to select the right projects that meet the requirements to get that funding for that project. So that amendment ended up not passing because of political squabbling, and the chair shut down all the debate and said, we're not passing any amendments, blah, blah, blah. And so we were a little bit miffed by that. But then what we found was a few months later, DOT issued their guidance, Federal Highways, on what qualifies under this carbon reduction program, and they pulled in the language from our amendment, and they made paving activities eligible. Well, what they added to it was that you have to use LCA, life cycle assessment, as an agency to quantify life cycle carbon emission reductions. So one of the things you could do for this, for example, is as an agency say, we're going to design this new highway or this reconstruction of a highway or the capacity expansion or whatever as a perpetual pavement. We're going to do a life cycle assessment. We're going to show that it's going to reduce emissions over the 20, 30, 40 years of its life cycle. And that would qualify this project for funding under this $6.4 billion tranche of funding available. So this is essentially expanding the market for our industry, opening our industry up to this funding. We're also looking at potentially we're working with the University of California and Virginia Tech to develop a framework that agencies can use to quantify how smoother pavements can reduce vehicle fuel consumption and therefore make pavement smoothness activities eligible for funding under this. So we think there's a couple of kind of digs, opportunities in this program to expand the market for our industry and to open up the $6.4 billion for paving activities. Okay, so that's a lot on policy. And let me now jump into, okay, by now you're probably thinking, I see that EPDs are going to be important. I see they're being pushed federally. I see there could be money available at the state or local level as an incentive if I have EPDs. So where do I get started? Right. So let's talk about this. And this part is actually pretty straightforward. So the EPD tool on our EPD program in general. So NAPA serves as the quote program operator for the EPD program for asphalt mixtures. Now, what that means is, we're responsible for developing the rules for developing EPDs for asphalt mixtures. And one of the meta things on this is we have general program instructions. It's sort of like our administrative rules. This is how we run the program in general. This is a transparent document. It's on our website, and it just kind of documents, how this program is operated. We also have we've commissioned a life cycle assessment. We've actually are on the second go around on this. That life cycle assessment supports the EPD program. It informs the EPD program. An EPD is based in part on life cycle assessment. So this provides kind of the technical, science background basis for the rules that we're going to develop, which are the product category rules for asphalt mixtures. So the PCR defines all the requirements for developing EPDs. So this LCA, we developed this LCA and we get it critically reviewed by an LCA professional. So there's a third party kind of looking at this. It's not just someone writing it and saying, here you go, right? And it meets certain ISO standards, and that's part of the critical review process. The PCR is reviewed by an independent panel, not just one person, but a panel of experts to make sure that it meets all the international ISO requirements. And it also goes through a public review and comment period. So and it's reviewed and revised every 5 years at a minimum. And then last year we published the second version of the PCR back in April. And then the fourth major component of this EPD program is the EPD software. That's Emerald Eco Label. So the EPD software is verified to ensure that it meets all the requirements of the PCR, which is, as I said, informed by the LCA and all under the requirements of the general program instructions, as well as all the international standards. So there's a lot of kind of checks and balances in here. So the EPD program itself is verified. And this is a really simple web-based software that lets mix producers just easily develop verified EPDs. These EPDs are going to be project specific and plant specific. So let's talk a little bit about that tool. So it's for product, I said project, I meant product specific, so mix specific and plant specific. Pretty much any asphalt plant in the US is eligible. We have a limitation for portable plants right now, but we're working on getting that functionality added. And this is, like I said, a really simple process. If you can use TurboTax, maybe you can't because TurboTax isn't always that easy, but it's similar to that, where it's just a web-based interactive kind of program. So when you're starting with Emerald Eco Label, the first thing you're going to do is register at the website, asphaltepd.org. We have a couple of webinars that we require you to watch. You have to pass the quizzes associated with those. We want to make sure you actually have at least some knowledge about what you're doing before you go in there and do this. We have a data gathering spreadsheet, which is going to help you compile the information that you need to enter into the software. You don't have to use this, but it's something that we provide to you. It really helps you just pull everything together into one place. It really simplifies the data entry process. You're going to purchase access to the tool for your plans. So you're going to enter your data, upload your supporting documentation in case you get audited. Then it's easy for an auditor to see where you're pulling your numbers from, and then voila, you have EPDs. So here's some examples of the data requirements that you're going to collect for your asphalt plant. This is not an exhaustive list, but it does cover the major items. One is we're looking for 12 consecutive months of data within the past 5 years. Generally, the more recent data is better in most cases. There may be exceptions to that if you had an extended outage or something like that, or weird conditions. You might not want to use the most recent 12 months, but generally within the past 5 years is required. You're going to collect data on things like how much fuel did your burner consume in your hot oil heater, and you have a generator on site, fuel consumption, your on-site equipment like your loaders and your skid steers, and that sort of thing. How much electricity did your plant consume? How much water did you consume? A lot of plants have a hard time. They don't actually track this, but we have ways to help them estimate their water consumption for purposes of this. And then how much mix did they produce and sell? Not just produce, but actually sell, because all those environmental burdens associated with all that fuel consumption and electricity consumption are going to get allocated on an average basis to the mix that you sold. We don't want to allocate burdens to your waste mix that you're going to go recycle and wrap or something. So that's the plant level data. Now, for the mixes, we're going to look at things like your mix design, right? What's the total, percentage by weight of your aggregates, your asphalt binder, virgin asphalt binder, your wrap, or if you're using shingles, recycled shingles, any additives that you're putting in the mix, or any other ingredients that are going in there, right? And then for those materials, how did they get to your plant? They come by truck, they come by rail, maybe by barge, ocean going vessel. And then we ask for your mixed production temperature. I'm going to say right from the beginning here, currently we don't have a way to change your EPD results based on actual mixed production temperature, but we are passing that information through, disclosing it to the EPD user or a reader, so that there's transparency. You can say, oh, this mix was produced at 270 degrees or 300 degrees or 340 degrees. And it's a way to at least communicate to the customer that maybe you're using a warm mix, or maybe this is really a little bit hotter than normal because it's polymer modified. But it does convey at least some information about that. So, we talked about the mix design requirements. So we have a good data for your specific plant on your plant's operational energy. But what about the impacts associated with manufacturing your raw materials, like your asphalt binder and your aggregates? And so we rely on a federal database for most of this information called the Federal LCA Commons. And this is a group of federal agencies that have a LCA kind of compendium of data from agencies as well as from industry. So it's all transparent, it's publicly available, it's free. So we pull that data into our software and we use that. Now, the advantages of this one, it's federally kind of backed to some extent. It's transparent, and it's of course free, so it keeps the cost down, as opposed to purchasing upstream data from proprietary data sets that are more like a black box. So one of the disadvantages is there's a lot of incomplete information about some materials in asphalt mixtures, in particular additives, things like your warm mix additives and rejuvenators and fibers, and other similar products. Some of your proprietary rubber modified binder, products. So if you have a data gap in your mix design, that's going to be disclosed on the EPD. This is an example of the cover page of an EPD. And you see that red box right there on the cover page, that data completeness statement. And that's indicating that, hey, this particular mix for this EPD has a material in it with a data gap. And the EPD is still valid, but it's just disclosing to the customer, being transparent to them, that there's something missing here. We're not sure quite how much it is. But it does on the subsequent page, which I'm not going to show you today. It'll have a list of ingredients and it'll indicate which one has the data gap. So also with the EPD software, when you get into the tool, we have a function that we added last year called the optimizer. And the optimizer lets you easily compare two of your own mixes to each other. Makes it super easy to kind of look at them side by side. And it lets you really drill down into not just those A1, A2, and A3 life cycle stages, the materials, transportation, and plant operations, but it look into specific unit processes, like each specific material, transporting each material, and then unit processes at the plant level, electricity versus burner fuel versus hot oil heater, et cetera. You can also think of it as a sandbox where you can create variants of your plant. You can say, well, you can run the what if scenarios. Like, what if we could reduce our electricity consumption by 10%? Or what if we change our fuel type from used oil to natural gas? It lets you run those scenarios and understand how that would affect your EPD results. The last thing it does, this is really cool, there's a couple of built-in tools to look at the cost and environmental impacts of certain specific changes, including switching fuel types and looking at aggregate moisture reduction. We actually know that aggregate moisture is one of the biggest opportunities to reduce emissions in our industry. And this lets you kind of look at each of your aggregate stockpiles and your average moisture contents and see what happens if you can drive those moisture contents down by better stockpile management practices or covering those stockpiles, whatever you can do to reduce moisture content. This lets you see the results of making those kinds of changes to your plant. This is a quick example of the output of the optimizer tool. This is the same mix produced from the same plant, but two different variants. So the one on the right burns natural gas, and the one on the left burns diesel fuel. And you'll see that big number there, 46.85 versus 38.31. This significant difference here, just by switching your fuel type, your burner fuel type from diesel fuel to natural gas, you can have a pretty significant reduction in carbon emissions. So this is what I mean by that granular view of seeing every single thing. This is just one example. Like, you might find very different kind of results for your mixes from your plants. And then we do have a webinar you can look at, a recorded webinar on the optimizer to help you understand how to use it. So I just have a slide on here to inform you of that. So let's talk about common questions about EPDs. This is kind of the tail end of the presentation here. And these are the most common things we get about them in general, especially as people are first starting to learn about these. The first one is, how much time does it take and what's it going to cost me to do this? So we're very transparent about our pricing schedule here. There's a significant discount for members, mostly because member dues have really underwritten the cost to develop this program, which has been a very substantial cost over the last 7 years or so. How much time does it take? Initial data collection, setting up your first plant, first couple of mixes, can be as little as a couple of weeks. Sometimes the company will take, if they're not working on it very steadily, it might take them a few months to pull all the data together. But once you get that first, get over that hump with your first plant and your first couple mixes, you set up your suppliers, new mixes, most people can do in about 10 or 15 minutes. So it's fairly straightforward once you're kind of in the system and running. Next question, can I get credit for running warm mix? And I kind of alluded to this in my previous comment here about we're averaging 12 months of data across all the mixes that you produce and sell over those 12 months. So if you produce a lot of warm mix at reduced temperature, you're going to see that benefit in your average. But if you're only doing a little bit for maybe specific projects or specific customers, you're not going to impact your overall average as much. So this is something we're working, we're planning to fund a project to kick off this year to develop a framework or a methodology to apply to our program for doing a mix specific temperature change. But currently we don't have that capability. What are the heavy hitters? What are the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions? And if you were looking closely at that image from the optimizer, you probably saw two of them. One of them is burner fuel consumption, and the second is your asphalt binder content. So when you're talking about burner fuel consumption, anything you can do to use a lower carbon fuel, with natural gas being the best kind of commonly available fuel from the carbon perspective, or to reduce your energy consumption at the plant, right? Your burner fuel consumption. That's where you start talking about warm mix and aggregate moisture content, but other energy efficiency measures you can employ. Tuning your burner, tuning your burner and tuning your flights for your expected wrap content to minimize waste heat coming out the stack and all that sort of thing. So there's a third component here, which is sometimes significant, sometimes overwhelming, and that's aggregate hauling. I'm not sure what the market looks like in South Carolina with respect to aggregate supply, but if you're hauling aggregates from more than maybe 50 miles away or so by truck, that starts becoming a very significant part of your EPD. I'm thinking also about Hawaii, where you have some mixed producers who are bringing in rock from Canada to Hawaii by ship. That will completely overwhelm the EPD results. You have a similar situation in Florida, where there are lots of published EPDs, and they also ship rock from Canada down to Florida, about 1,200, 1,500 miles or so sometimes. That can cause an EPD's global warming potential, or GWP, increase from, say, 50 to maybe 120 just by that aggregate hauling. So aggregate hauling can be very significant. It's actually a very carbon intensive process relative to all the other aspects of making a mix. And what I like to say about this is that the carbon footprint of an asphalt mix is so low that hauling becomes really, really, really important if you're hauling long distances. So that's one way to think of it if you're an optimist. So next question, can we use EPDs for pavement type selection? This is the constant, asphalt versus concrete, which one's lower carbon? Can I use EPDs to support this sort of decision making? And the simple answer is no. The complicated answer is no. And we can talk about this one for a whole hour if you want to, or longer. We could probably talk about it for weeks. But the simple part of it is there are different PCRs for asphalt and concrete products. And so they're complying to different rules. So it doesn't make sense to compare them because they might be using different upstream data sets for things like electricity or energy use and that sort of thing, or even raw materials to that extent. And also, the performance expectations are different. So similar to where you wouldn't want to compare, say, a surface mix to a binder course or something like that, you wouldn't compare an asphalt to a concrete pavement because they're going to have different performance characteristics. Now, if you could harmonize all those upstream kind of data issues, you could plug EPDs into a comparative LCA and look at that. But then there's a lot of challenges and issues with modeling the use stage. There's like a whole bunch of models out there, for example, for modeling how pavement smoothness and other pavement properties affect vehicle fuel consumption. But for some of those models, there's really no consensus as to how accurate they are and how reflective of reality they are. So if you're going to use them for decision making, you're going to be making decisions based on models that have never been really validated in the field and have a lot of uncertainty associated with them. Probably that uncertainty is exceeding the level of difference between two pavement types. So something to be very cautious of. And it's that you start getting really advanced stuff when you start going down this road. So just a quick kind of heads up. The last one is policy considerations, right? I'm not sure what exactly is going to happen in South Carolina. We've seen a lot on what's happening at the federal level, but we talked about how, you should be thinking about how each agency spec or mix type is a different product, right? We don't know what those programs, we have a little bit of clarity now on, some programs like through the Inflation Reduction Act, where it's going to be, I think, an incentive based on the 20th and 40th and whatever percentile. So that's we're starting to get some clarity there, but it's still not entirely clear. And I think there's opportunities for that to change, what those policies are, how they're shaped. The other thing is to think about regional variations. Things like climate from one part of a state to another. I think about this in terms of a state like Oregon, right? Western Oregon rains all the time. Eastern Oregon is almost a desert, right? So you have probably a lot more aggregate moisture in the western part of the state than in the eastern part of the state. So that's an example of where climate variations can be significant. Because that's going to affect your aggregate moisture and then your EPD results. Aggregate supply. We talked about shipping rock, right? So maybe you're using, say, a friction surface course, friction surface mix, and it requires a high friction aggregate, and all you have is limestone that polishes and doesn't meet the friction requirements. So for that, in a certain part of the state, you're going to be pulling in rock from maybe a few hundred miles away to meet the friction requirements, right? So, but maybe for another part of the state, it's available locally. So you should be thinking about how that's going to affect you. The other one is availability of fuels. Not every area of every state has access to natural gas lines, and you might be in different grid locations. And so the grid location can vary your energy impact by as much of as an order of magnitude or more, even from one zip code in one state to the next. So these factors are all important. And as an example, I one time about a year ago was on a call and I said, you know what, maybe in a small state like Connecticut, you probably won't have regional variations. There was somebody on that call and they said, well, we operate in Connecticut. And what do you know? From one half of the state to the other, because of the different type of aggregate supply and the absorption in that aggregate, the binder content can vary by 0.5%. And I ran some numbers on what a 0.5% change in binder content looks like in a kind of standard conventional mix. It can change your EPD results by anywhere from 5 to 8 or 10%. So that relatively small change from one side of Connecticut to another can have as much as a 5 or 8 or 10% difference from one side of the state to the other. So something to be mindful of. The last thing is, we talked about how we're using this LCA Commons kind of generic data for upstream materials. We have data gaps, right? We expect the upstream data to get better over time. We know that the Asphalt Institute, for example, is developing an EPD program for asphalt binders. So one day, instead of using a generic number for your entire asphalt binder across the country, you'll have your refinery or your terminal that you're procuring your binder from will actually provide you with an EPD, which will then get used to develop your EPDs, right? And so when we start getting plant-specific, supply chain-specific data for raw materials like aggregates, and asphalt binder, filling some of these data gaps for additives, we're going to see the GWP results go up and down potentially very significantly. And so we've seen some policies like in Colorado, once they set their GWP limits, they can only bring them down, they can never raise them up based on the state law. So we have some concerns that we're going to get better data in the future, and there might be some things that go up. We don't have a lot of control over that just because we're getting better data, not because of actual changes in upstream emissions. So that's definitely a concern to be thinking about, and you can start going down the rabbit hole of policy implications and implementation issues and challenges. But the important thing is really to just get started thinking about this stuff. So just wrapping up here, a couple of key takeaways. One, if you haven't learned this already, what do we use EPDs for? We use them to quantify environmental impacts, and they're also verified, right? Really important. Two is we see these buy clean policies, they're spreading quickly. So coming soon to a theater near you, maybe an agency near you, a job, a project near you. This is going to be accelerated by the Inflation Reduction Act. This is happening now. It's not something that might happen in the future. This is in process, right? We know there are existing practices and technology that we talked about that we can use to reduce emissions. We talked about binder content, using more wrap, for example. We talked about aggregate moisture and warm mix, right? These are just a few examples of things that you can do to reduce your environmental impacts. And the best thing you can do, if you haven't already done this, is start preparing by developing EPDs for one of your plants. Understand the system, start understanding how it works. And then as you feel it's appropriate to start expanding to other plants, you can start benchmarking your operations and really understanding how many degrees of freedom you have. What are your opportunities to reduce emissions, and really get out ahead of this and turn this into a business opportunity and not a threat. With that, I just want to thank everyone here on the call for listening to me rant for an hour or so. And I'm happy to take any questions. And Jason, do you want to MC the Q&A portion? Or?
Yeah, sure thing. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, cool. I guess the first was just regarding a copy of the presentation for attendees, which we can certainly provide if that's good. The other was, the first, really the long question we had in the chat box was, is the data required for an EPD typically collected by plants?
Yeah, most plants have pretty much all the data required. I did say you do run into some issues from time to time, water consumption being a challenge. For that one, most plants will say, well, we have a water truck and it runs twice a day, 3,000 gallons. They add up the number of days the plant runs and they just run the numbers. And then they say, okay, here's our estimated water consumption. You also run into issues where you have an asphalt plant located inside a quarry and the same company owns everything and they don't sub-meter the utilities. So you have to figure out a way to allocate that fuel consumption or that electricity consumption across the operations. Ideally, you'll sub-meter your operations, you'll get better data that way. But those are the types of challenges that folks often run into. They're rarely insurmountable, right? They're usually relatively easy to deal with.
Gotcha. I've got I guess a hand up with John Young. I'm going to ask him to unmute so he can ask his question.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Joseph, you mentioned something about temporary plants. And so what if a plant is permitted as temporary, but it's in a permanent location? Is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm familiar with some of the plants in Hawaii that meet that requirement. They have an air permit that says it's a mobile plant, it's a temporary permit, but the plant never moves, right? You could probably today develop an EPD for them, but then we expect to bring on the portable plant function in April of this year. That's knock on wood. We're hoping that'll happen. Or certainly within the first half of this year for sure. So we're not too far off from those plants. The true portable is actually being able to develop EPDs as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Joseph, we got another, I guess, comment, and I may ask Cliff to unmute just to follow up on it, but it was a data request for plants.
Yeah, Jason, this is a great presentation. I just had a question about kind of along the same what we were talking about just a second ago about if you didn't have the 12 months of consecutive data, consider a new plant, or someone just purchased a plant from someone else and didn't have that. I don't remember exactly what the slide was, but I think it had something to do with, as well with dealing with 60 months or 5 years worth of information. If you just didn't have that, could you go with 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months and just prorate that?
That's a good question. So we actually had that come up in Colorado where they have, now state requirements, and they got a producer who got a job and they're building a new plant that won't go online until say April or May of this year. And so what we're issuing is I'll call it interim guidance. I'm going to use the EPA's terminology here. Is what you would do is you'd use the calendar year as your 12-month period. So you'd start January 1 and run your 12-month data collection period through the end of this year, for example.
Right.
And then starting in January of next year, you develop EPDs. And then once you get the full 12-month data set, then we'd ask you to go ahead and update that, just because you'll have just a more complete data set at that point.
Right. So I understand your drying costs are going to be different in your summer than in your winter, as far as your temperatures and all, and having to use as much gas, and your moisture contents are generally lower in the summertime, and a lot of that's going to take effect, or affect those numbers in the computations.
Right. Yeah. And the 12 months is 12 months within the past 5 years.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you had a weird year last year because your plant was decommissioned or something happened. Maybe you had very low production compared to normal, or very high
Right.
production compared to normal. Maybe you use your data from 2 years ago instead, right? So
Gotcha.
you want to
Okay.
be more be as representative of your current operations as you can be.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. John, did you have a question? And then we'll get to Brian's question next.
Okay, Joseph, you referenced that there's contractors that import material from Canada. So how do you develop a standard or requirement when you have that situation where you're going to have one or two contractors that just have a high number, and the others you got local aggregates, so they don't have that? Is that what happens in those situations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the reasons that the Florida contractors have been so proactive in developing and publishing EPDs is they know that a lot of the mix producers in that state have very significantly high EPDs relative to the rest of the country. And then also within the state, there are pretty significant variations, right? If you're in North Florida, maybe you have your own aggregate supply, or you're close to Georgia where you're pulling rock in. But if you're in like Tampa, it might be coming from Canada. And there's a big difference between Jacksonville and Tampa and your EPD results, right? So, so they got out ahead of this, or they're working on it to really make sure when these policies come down, they have a very strong case to say we need very regional specific data. I think the Hawaii case is a little bit different because it's not quite the same kind of constraints or business kind of situation. And I'm not really sure what the best approach there is, but if you just look at the guidance, you're talking about the 20th percentile, the 40th percentile, the industry average, if locally available. And if you don't meet the industry average, you don't qualify for that incentive, right? And I think a lot of the question about this hinges on the question of, are you offering an incentive, or are you requiring like a threshold, right? If it's an incentive, then it's like, okay, I don't qualify for the incentive. That's my cost of doing business by shipping rock from Canada, right? But if it's a threshold where you have to be below it, I get really nervous about that sort of thing, because that essentially would close out those contractors from eligibility. So that's where it's really helpful to be engaged and involved, and to be able to advocate for your industry and your company, saying we can't have these kind of policies because these GWP limits and as a pre-qualification threshold, because it just doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, it sounds like an incentive would be better than a threshold for us.
Right. And when I talk to contractors across the country, I talk about this sort of thing, and you talk about pre-qualification limits, and they get really nervous and sometimes irate. And then you talk about incentives, and they're like, we do incentives all the time on smoothness, on density, on speed of construction. And it just falls more in line with how contracts tend to be structured in this industry. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, John. Another question we had, Joseph, and this is, I guess, more of like a NAPA related question, but it was, how can a company endorse the Road Forward initiative or this initiative? It was just one of the slides earlier in the presentation showed a list of companies that are current financial supporters.
Yeah. So the Road Forward, we launched a partnership program. We actually closed it in September for new kind of partners. But we're going to reopen that immediately after our annual meeting, so early February. But if you're interested, just send me an email to Brian. You've got my email address. Should put that on this last slide. But it's super easy to find my email address. Send me an email, or really anyone at NAPA, and they'll route you in the right direction. Say I'm interested in learning, becoming a Road Forward partner, and we'll give you all the details about that.
We had in the chat, just wanted to open it up to if any other attendees had any questions for Joseph. I'm gonna.
Just one quick comment I want to make. I know that nobody in South Carolina has published any EPDs, but I do know of a couple of companies that are in the process of developing EPDs and maybe have already finished developing EPDs, but just haven't chosen to hit the publish button yet. So there is some action going on in the state, and there are other companies that have plants in your state that are developing EPDs in other states and other locations. And so there's definitely action going on, whether you see it or not. There's stuff going on in the background.
Yeah, I know, at least from my vantage point, Joseph, I've had several contractors just reach out, and prior to today's webinar, just trying to learn a little bit more about the EPD tool and how to get that started. And obviously when you do that, you have some education and a quiz, I guess, with that as well. But I do think just hearing a lot of the context behind that today is incredibly helpful. So you may see more on that here in the coming months.
Yeah, another quick comment I want to make here on, sometimes get comments of, boy, that's a lot of money, $3,000 a plant and that sort of thing. And I any place a plant can save money or not spend money, I understand is significant. One thing that's unique about our program and our industry is as the trade association running this program, all that revenue stays in the industry. It helps us do a better job of supporting the industry. In most other industries, you have independent consultants, companies who are offering these services. So that's different in a sense, because we're here to support the industry. That's our primary mission and goal in life. That's why we exist as an organization. So that's just something to think about in terms of the benefits of what we're doing, kind of getting out ahead of this stuff.
We understand. What I'm going to do for the attendees is if you're good with this, Joseph, I'm going to put your email in the chat function real quick, just so everyone has that. Make sure
Yep.
Shacat. So I believe other than that, seeing no other questions, we'll wrap up and we'll stop here. But again, like I mentioned earlier, just if folks do require any professional development hours, please email me at jrjordan@SC Asphalt or info@scasphalt.org. But other than that, I just want to thank Joseph for your time today. Just very informative presentation, and really look forward to seeing what comes out of this here locally in South Carolina in the months to come. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. And don't be afraid to reach out if you have any questions. I'm here to answer those questions.
Awesome.
Thank you, Joseph. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank
All
you.
right.